Okay, it is 2 o'clock now, so we're going to go ahead and get this bee party started today. Welcome, everyone. My name is Stacy Matrazo, and I'm the Executive Director of the Florida Wildflower Foundation. Thanks so much for joining us for today's webinar, Florida's Native Bees, Biology, Identification, and Conservation. This Friday is World Bee Day, so what better way to celebrate than with a discussion on our native bees. For those of you not familiar with our organization, our mission is to protect, connect, and expand native wildflower habitats through education, research, planting, and conservation programs. And our work is made possible largely through the sale and renewal of the Florida State Wildflower License Plate. This is our old plate. We redid it a couple of years ago, but whether you have the old one or the new one, you are supporting us and we appreciate it. The funds from these license plates, along with donations and memberships, allow us to support and create projects that build awareness and knowledge of native wildflowers and plants throughout Florida. And we'd like to encourage those of you who find our programs valuable to consider becoming a member, making a donation, or purchasing the State Wildflower License Plate. And if you purchase the tag, you're also eligible for membership. You just need to let us know that you have the tag and we'll get you set up in our database. Be sure to check out our website for information on upcoming webinars and field trips. We've got a really great slate of programs coming up in the next couple months. Our next one is creating a pollinator pot with Kirsten Sharp, and that is happening on June 22nd and will be happening during National Pollinator Week. So again, we're trying to celebrate the insects that bring life to our ecosystems and make our lives possible. Follow us on social media and on our website or our newsletter to stay up to date on what we are offering. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. This webinar is being recorded. It will be available on our website and our YouTube channel in about 48 hours. We'll also send an email to you with a link to the recording, along with some resources from today's talk and a short survey that we'd like you to take a few moments to fill out as well. All attendees are muted with your cameras off. If you have questions, please use the Q&A feature to submit them. The chat is live, but we will be taking questions through the Q&A feature. So make sure you use that if you have a question for our speaker. If we don't get to all the questions in time before the end of our presentation, you can email them to us at info@flawildflowers.org, and we will make sure to get those to our presenter. So now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker. John Ternest is a PhD student in the Mallinger Pollinator Ecology Lab of the University of Florida's Entomology and Nematology Department. John's research focuses on commercial blueberry production, and he's taken a multidisciplinary approach to improving pollination and yield through bee behavior, flower traits, and farm management. He earned his bachelor's degree at the University of Colorado Boulder and a master's degree from Purdue University, where he studied integrative pest and pollinator management in commercial watermelon production. His previous work has inspired him to continue researching bees, specifically at the intersection of ecology and agricultural management. You can follow John on Twitter at TernestJ, and we'll include that in the resources too, if you'd like to keep up to date with what he's doing. Follow him for updates on his research, photos of insects, and a glimpse into the life of a graduate student. Thank you so much, John, for being here today. I will stop my share and let you take over.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm really excited to be here today and talk to you all about Florida's native bees and focus a little bit on the biology, identification, and conservation of these bees. As you may have noticed, I have a light that is on a sensor that I don't don't hit. So you might see me waving my arms like this periodically, trying to get the light back on. That'll be a common feature. So, okay, so a quick presentation outline that just to kind of give us an idea of what we'll be talking about today. So first, we'll start out with just the importance of pollinators and their value to our ecosystems and our crop production systems. Then we'll look specifically at bees as pollinators, focus in a little bit on bee diversity across Florida, the US, and the globe. I have a quick section here on managed bees that we'll talk about, and then we'll really get into the wild native bees, their biology, nesting, important groups, and some specific species you might run into, and then conservation and the challenges that bees are facing and how we can help them. So to start off, why are pollinators important? So some of you may already know some of these things, but pollinators are crucial for plant reproduction. And you'll see here in this figure, this is two flowers. We have on the left here, the anther, which produces pollen circled. And then on the right, the stigma, which receives pollen and leads to plant reproduction and seed set, fruit set, whatever trait of interest you're interested in. So this pollen transfer from the anther to the stigma is what leads to this, this fruit set and reproduction. And some plants actually require cross-pollination. So you can't just have the same pollen from one flower ending up on the same flower and getting good reproduction. And some of these plants are only pollinated by animals. Not all of these flowers have both male and female reproductive organs. And so in those cases, you're really reliant on something transferring pollen from one flower to another. And that's where pollinators are really valuable. So in natural habitats, pollinators are, again, incredibly important. So about 85% of our angiosperms, or flowering plants, are animal pollinated. And they're crucial for helping to maintain plant diversity and the seed and fruit production that ultimately occurs as a result of this pollination. So these pollinators in a landscape like this that you see here on the bottom are going to be making visits to various flowers and across that entire landscape. And that's going to lead to reproduction and more output of those flowers, the seeds and resources that the flowers produce. And then this has an effect on all of the organisms that are relying on those flowers for seeds or eating insects that are consuming pollen and nectar. And you can really see how without bees and other pollinators helping to get this pollination done, that the system would really be much less diverse and much less able to sustain in kind of this natural ecosystem function. This is also true in agriculture and agricultural crops. So some really nice studies from about 15 years ago now found that 87 of our 115 most commonly cultivated crops across the globe were at least somewhat dependent on pollinators. And that actually led to about 35% of crop production worldwide. So we always like to say about 1 in every 3 bites of food that you eat is directly a result of some kind of pollination from animals. And in a figure like this, picture like this, you can see most of those really colorful food groups, things like peppers, watermelon, squash, and some of the other things on there like strawberries are going to be the things that are the most dependent on pollinators. Some things like corn and soybeans don't have this pollinator dependency. And so pollinators, although they're contributing 35% of what you're eating, they are also really helping to color up our plates and get us a lot of our most tasty food items. And of course, pollinators come in a lot of shapes and sizes. So things like butterflies, flies, this is actually a bee mimic fly there in the middle, bats, birds, beetles, and of course bees are all pollinators. And some of these things like these bats, they can have really closely tied specialist relationships where they're only visiting one flower species and they're the only pollinator for that. So in a system like that, you can imagine how important that single bat species is for that flowering plant. But bees are the most important pollinators. And if you're not already convinced of that, hopefully I'll be able to do that. So bees are both abundant and diverse, and those things don't always go together. Sometimes they're in contradiction to each other. But basically what I mean here is that they're available throughout the entire world, and there are a lot of species that are both generalists that visit just about any flowering resource they can find, to specialists with those really closely tied relationships like I talked about with the bat. They also are actively collecting pollen to feed their young. And this is one of the areas that I think really stands out from other pollinators. So many other pollinators may go and visit. You think of something like a butterfly will visit a flower, collect nectar as it's on the flower, and then fly to another flower. But it's doing most of that consumption on that single flower and then moving to another. Whereas bees are collecting the pollen, and that ends up with more pollen on their bodies and more pollen that is being transferred as they subsequently visit more flowers. So they're not consuming everything they collect as they're on each individual flower. They're taking pollen from one flower to another purposefully. And bees also exhibit what we call flower constancy or fidelity. So this is a bee I'll talk about a little more in depth later, the southeastern blueberry bee. And this bee is a specialist on blueberry and closely related plants. And so they'll visit blueberry over and over and over on a foraging trip. But this is also true of most of our generalists, where once they find a flower resource they like on an individual foraging trip, they'll continue to visit that flower. And from the plant's perspective, this is really valuable because it means that any pollen that's being transferred from one flower to the next is going to be of the same species and could lead to reproduction. If they were visiting what flower species A and collected pollen and then went on to flower species B on the next visit, any pollen that it transfers from A to B wouldn't be valuable for that plant's reproduction. So all three of these things together kind of come together to show why bees are really our most important pollinators across the globe. So really quickly, I want to talk about honeybees. This is probably the bee that most people are the most familiar with. So honeybees, as it says here, are not a conservation target. And the main reason for that is that they're non-native. So honeybees, as you may have heard, are experiencing colony declines across the US. And this is really detrimental and a problem, but these are managed species that are managed by beekeepers. They're not native to this area. And so most of our conservation efforts should really be focused on our native bees that are kind of out there on their own and are really reliant on the flowers and the habitat that is available to them. They don't have farmer or beekeepers that are able to supplement their resources. And so they're really the ones that are most at risk, even though honeybees are important and have their own concerns. So they provide supplemental pollination services that are already provided by native pollinators. So oftentimes they're brought onto farms and kind of help out with that pollination. And in the US, honeybees, as many years as about 2000, so about 20 years ago, they were valued at over $15 billion due to the increased yield and quality of fruits and crops due to their pollination. So incredibly valuable, but again, just not a primary target of conservation efforts. And so much of that pollination that's occurring is done by honeybees, but the majority of it is really going to be native bees that are responsible for it. So here's just kind of a nice photo collage of some different native bees that we'll talk about. Okay, so this is usually fairly interactive, but of course we can't do that today. So I just want you to kind of think to yourself how many bee species you think there are in each of these regions. So in Florida, in North America, I know that only shows the US, but in the entirety of North America, and then in the entire globe. So think about that for a second, and then we'll get going once people have kind of had a second to think about it. So first, in Florida, we have actually over 300 species of bees that are native to Florida. And what's really interesting there is that about 29 of those species are endemic to Florida, which means in the entire world, they can only be found here and nowhere else. In North America, we actually have over 4,000 species of native bees. So again, even more. If you're like a lot of people, they drastically underestimate Florida and then overcompensate for North America. So if you started off with like 10 and then went to 50,000, that's pretty common. That's what everyone does. And then this third one, people tend to kind of stabilize and see how many species there are. And for the entire world, we have over 20,000 species of bees. So just really keep in mind how much diversity there is. I'm just going to be scratching the surface on Florida and global bee species, and they're all very different. We can't place them all in really tight groups like we can things like honeybees, for example. So to that point, native bees aren't homogeneous. There's incredible variation in their pollinator behavior, their floral preference, their size and appearance, and their life history, and how they're nesting, reproducing, and finding food resources. So with that in mind, native wild bees, they have this really interesting range of sociality and foraging and nesting behaviors that we'll look at. They're also effective pollinators for both crop and wild plants. So very valuable for our natural ecosystems, but also our cultivated food crops. And then interestingly, most native bees are actually nesting below ground. So about 70% of our native bee species are below ground, which contributes to why so much of the general public is unaware of so many of these species and never encounters them. And here on the bottom, you can kind of see a nice image. Number 9 there is a bumblebee. We've got a carpenter bee at 10. We've actually got some native bees at 8 and 7 that are close in size to a honeybee. So if that's the one you're most familiar with. And then you can see all the way down to 0, just the incredible variation in different species size, which also of course contributes to making them hard to detect and understand for most people. So here are some species or some groups of families that are interesting and important, and we'll talk about a little bit here today. So again, with the bees of Florida, I really wanted to focus in on that, being that this is the Florida Wildflower Foundation. So again, we have over 300 species, 29 of which can only be found in Florida. Interestingly, many of those are cuckoo or kleptoparasitic bees, about 20% of our overall species. And that basically just means that they're laying their eggs on the resources of another species of the bee. So species A will bring back some nectar and pollen rewards from flowers to its nest. And then these cuckoo bees will actually lay an egg in that area. The bee will come back and there's already an egg, and that cuckoo bee will actually be the one developing, not the bee that did all the hard work. We also have a lot of sand nesting bees, which you could kind of expect based on how many sandy soils we have. That's an interesting feature of our Florida bees. And then we have a pretty high diversity of a couple of our groups, the leafcutter and mining bees, which I'll talk about more. So this first kind of big divide in biology that I wanted to talk about is our social bees and our solitary bees. So when people think of bees, they're usually thinking social because of their previous knowledge of honeybees or bumblebees. And for our native bees, social bees are mostly bumblebees. There are some other species that can be social as well, things like sweat bees. But for the majority of this, just think of bumblebees when you're thinking of social native bees. They actually are able to do cooperative brood care. So they'll have offsprings of the queen that are taking care of other offsprings. They have this reproductive division of labor. So some bees will be doing one task, other bees will be like foraging, other bees may be caring for the brood. And then you have a queen, which is laying the eggs and accounts for that overlapping generations. Because you have a queen, which is the mother of the entire colony, present at the same time as the workers. And then for our solitary bees, that accounts for about 90% of all North American bees. And so really, again, the vast majority, although you probably think of social bees mostly when you're thinking of bees, the vast majority are going to be this solitary life cycle where they're not living in colonies, and they work individually to provision their own nests and offspring. So they're much like most animals. They're going out collecting their own food resources, mating on their own, and then caring for their offspring. Whereas bumblebees and honeybees are kind of this unique case where they have a queen that's laying all the eggs and the workers are just taking care of all of her offspring. So although it seems unusual for bees, the solitary life cycle is much more similar to other animals. For the social bees, as I mentioned, the majority are solitary. So keep that in mind. But for the social bees, they're going to have this life cycle where they're being cared for by an adult. And then when the egg is laid, they'll be provisioned with food resources. Larvae will develop, pupae will develop, and then you get an adult at the end of that. For bumblebees in particular, this nesting cycle is typically happening right at the ground level or just below ground level. So they'll often utilize abandoned rodent nests, tufts of grass, or underneath other structures, whether man-made or natural. And you can see here in this nice figure from the Xerces Society that if you start here at the top, you have a hibernating queen. Once it becomes warm enough, she'll emerge in the spring and she'll start laying eggs and establishing a nest, collecting resources. Then once she starts to have offspring emerging from those initial eggs, she'll only be laying eggs. The offspring will be the ones that are actively foraging, collecting resources for the nest and caring for the brood. And that's kind of the summer colony peak. Eventually, the colony will reach a size where the old queen will start developing new queens, and those new queens will then eventually go out and get mated. They'll seek an overwintering spot and start to cycle over again. As you'll see in the kind of end of the fall, when the colony's reached its end, the old queen will die. And so these are annual colony life cycles. Each individual queen will live for a year, but her colony is also only living for a year. And then a new queen from that previous colony is founding a new colony. So a little bit more about these bumblebees. So as probably a lot of you know, they're large-bodied and quite fuzzy. So they've got a lot of hairs all over their bodies, typically pretty bright colored, black with white or yellowish red, orange, brown stripes. So they're eusocial. That's what I was just talking about with the reproductive division of labor and the brood care. And they're nesting right at or below ground level. And so bumblebees are able to store pollen and nectar in their colonies. And in this kind of bottom right image here, you can see what some of that looks like. So some of those are areas where they're storing their brood, kind of the capped ones. And then oftentimes they'll store nectar resources in the open cells that you can see there. And so this is enough to provision their offspring for that annual colony life cycle. But unlike something like honeybees, they're not producing large honey stores because they're not concerned with getting the colony through the entire winter life cycle when there's not going to be any flower and nectar resources. So this is really used during the colony's life cycle, usually from spring to fall, and then they're not producing enough honey that it would be useful to us as humans to collect, for example. So some bumblebees that you might see in Florida, these are all going to be fairly common groups down here, really interesting bees. They're all going to be living that same kind of colony life cycle like I talked about. They're all generalist bees so that you can see them on just about any flowering plant that you have available. But one of the really important ways that you can actually identify these different species is through the different markings. So the Bombus bimaculatus, which is the two-spotted bumblebee here, you can kind of see these two spots on its thorax. That one's a pretty obvious name. Bombus pennsylvanicus, our American bumblebee, has these really thick bands of yellowish brown stripes. And then a few of these others, the impatiens and griseocolus, they're a little more, their colors are a little more on their thorax, less on their abdomens, with the differentiation being between them is this kind of yellowish orange or brown belt that is on the abdomens of some of these individuals. So those are some that you can run into fairly commonly around here. I would say that I probably most frequently see Bombus impatiens, our common eastern bumblebee. The American bumblebee, Pennsylvanicus, with the really bold stripes, is also a pretty large bee, so it can be pretty noticeable. But if you keep your eyes peeled, you can run into all of these. Unfortunately, we also have some bumblebees that are at risk here in Florida. So the American bumblebee, which I just talked about, that's often quite large with those bold stripes, they were actually listed by the IUCN Red List as vulnerable. And they formerly had a very broad range that's declining kind of across that range. but especially in the northern parts of it. So this is a bee that occupied much of the eastern half of the US. And in those kind of northern extents of the range, it's really declining, and there's a lot of concern around it. Another bee that is even has more concerns around it is the southern plains bumblebee, which you can see here in the middle. And it's actually been listed as endangered. So it's our only endangered bumblebee in Florida, and really an area of concern. If you're interested more in that, I provided some resources from the Xerces Society and the IUCN list that can give you a little more information on that specific bee, but it's really important that we can identify it if we have it in our areas, because it is so at risk. And then the yellow bumblebee, which is actually pretty easy to tell apart because it does have so much yellow on it. It was also listed as vulnerable. And if these kind of steady declines that we've seen continue, it could lead to an extinction event in about 70 to 80 years. So a lot of these bees are really at risk. And with their value, their importance to our ecosystems and our agricultural systems, it's not only important because they're their own species that are valuable, but it offers a lot of value to us as human beings, and it's really important that we do our best to protect them. Okay, so on to solitary bees, which again make up about 90% of our native bees. Typically, we're going to see about one generation per year. Florida kind of shifts that a little bit. So some of these species in Florida, because of the longer summer, or more accurately, probably the shorter winters, we sometimes see these species that usually have one generation in a year, pushing that to two or potentially even three. And so they'll be able to reproduce and make this life cycle multiple times a year in a warm place like Florida. And adults are typically living only about a few weeks to a couple months, depending on the species, but the rest of their year is actually spent as egg, larvae, and pupae. And you can see in this figure here in the top right, that's kind of the development you would see. So larvae here on the left and middle cells, and then you've got developing pupae there on the rightmost cell. And they typically spend a dormant overwintering period as pre-pupae. So that's kind of right before they're about to pupate, and then it will warm up, and eventually they'll emerge into the spring as adults. So for their nesting, the majority of wild bees are actually nesting below ground. So we've got things like mining bees, plaster bees, sweat bees, and longhorn bees, of course, in addition to the bumblebees that I already spoke about. And oftentimes they'll create little cavities like you can see in this image here, and they'll have individual chambers where they will have a mixture of pollen and nectar, lay an egg on it, and that will develop through the immature life cycle from egg to larvae to pupae, consuming that resource. And you can see a closer up image of what that looks like on the right. So one of the groups that you'll run into occasionally is pollictids or sweat bees. This is actually a pretty common group. There's a lot of different species, but interestingly, they get their name from being attracted to human sweat. So occasionally you'll see something small and kind of metallic green, metallic black land on you, and they're actually oftentimes drinking the sweat off of your skin for, of course, the water, but also it's thought that some of the salts in our sweat are of value to them. This is a very large and widespread group. They're typically pretty small, up to medium size. So a lot of these are going to be around the size of a grain of rice, with some being a little bit bigger than that. They're mostly solitary, ground nesting species, but we do have actually, this is one of the groups that I mentioned that does have a few species that also have a social component. A well-represented genera is Lasioglossum. That's one that you'll see very frequently. A lot of those are going to be a little more dull color than some of these bees that you see on the slide, but they're still going to have that kind of metallic blackish look to them. And of course, they're often this metallic green and can be really brightly colored. Another group that's nesting below ground is our mining bees. And that name makes a lot of sense when you think about their nesting biology. So they're digging these nests, like we saw in the previous slide, about 6 inches up to a few feet below ground, making provisions for offspring where they have where they have a nectar and pollen mix and an egg laid on top of it. Typically, they're very small to medium bodied. They have relatively wide faces. So if you see a bee, if you're really familiar with bees, that's a character that can be pretty useful to you. Some of the genera that are really important are Andrena and Perdita. And interestingly, the Perdita are actually the smallest bees in the world, commonly known as the fairy flies. Another group that nests below ground, or a couple of groups, are longhorn bees and digger bees. And these are typically medium to large bodied bees. So oftentimes around the size of a honeybee, but a little bit smaller than bumblebees. They're typically black with yellow or white stripes on them, kind of that common bee look that you think of. They're solitary ground nesters. And the longhorn bees in particular have these really long antennae, especially in the males, which you can see in this kind of upper right picture. And those are actually used for seeking out females for mates. Many of these bees are specialists, so they'll specialize on a specific plant species or group of plants that are closely related. And then some important groups, again, are these digger bees and longhorn bees, which I'll talk a little bit more about a specific group of the digger bees. So that specific digger bee that we have is the Havropoda laboriosa, also known as the southeastern blueberry bee. And it's actually native to Florida, so something that you can see kind of early in the spring, visiting things like wild blueberry or cultivated blueberry if you're fortunate, like I am, to be out in blueberry fields all spring. But these bees can actually also be found quite far north and throughout a lot of the eastern part of the US. So a pretty common bee, but it does have a pretty short activity period as an adult. So it's only active in the early spring when these flowers that it specializes on are actively blooming. And of course, like I said, it specializes on blueberry plants. So things like our wild blueberries, of which we have about 8 or 9 species in Florida, but also on our cultivated crops, specifically on the stuff that's emerging a little bit later in the season. They have this cool behavior called buzz pollination, and this is part of what makes them really valuable pollinators for blueberry. They're actually able to attach to the flower, like you see in this image, and then rapidly beat their wings so that they can get more pollen to release. And this makes them really effective pollinators and far more effective per visit than things like honeybees. So moving on to some of our above nesting bees, which make up the minority, about 30%. Some of those groups are mason bees, carpenter bees, leaf cutters, some of our sweat bees and resin bees. And typically they're using pre-existing cavities, but our carpenter bees are able to excavate wood, and that's how they get their name. So mason and leafcutter bees are one of these groups in the family Megachilidae. They're also solitary. So again, a pretty common feature you're going to see across a lot of these bees. They're nesting mostly above ground, as I mentioned. They're oftentimes around the size of a honeybee to a little smaller as well. And Megachile and Osmia, which you can see here in the top left and middle left respectively, are going to be 2 of our really common kind of groups or genera that you might run into. The Megachile are using leaves or flower petals, which you can see to the right of that green bee. And they actually turn those into individual cells. And then again, will lay an egg on top of pollen and nectar stores that they've collected. Meanwhile, the Osmia are using things like muds that they're collecting or other materials. So they're often creating little partitions in their cells with mud, and then again, pollen and nectar with an egg laid on top of it. The Megachile are often black with a lot of white striping, white to yellow striping, and then the Osmia are typically this kind of dark metallic green to blue. So for that, the mason bees, here's just a little closer picture. They're oftentimes nesting in things like stems, reeds, beetle burrows, or other long cavities, oftentimes in wood, but usually out in their natural habitat that were created by other forces or other species. And so again, they're going to lay several individuals in cells kind of adjacent to each other. And so I'll get into this a little bit more, but when you're thinking about things like bee houses, this is an area that you really have to think about. The leafcutter bees, as I mentioned, are using kind of these partitions with leaves and flowers, and they're also using typically stems, reeds, beetle burrows to make these tubes. Okay, so a group that a lot of you are probably familiar with, some of which you're probably familiar with for not as good of reason, are carpenter bees. Xylicopa are our large carpenter bees, whereas Ceratina are the smaller ones down here on the bottom, which again are kind of this metallic greenish blue color. The Xylicopa can often be spotted by this kind of very large appearance. So they're going to be our largest bees on that previous figure I showed. And they have this really bare kind of reflective coloring on their abdomens. These bees are mostly solitary, although sometimes they'll be nesting in kind of congregations. So people might think that they're in colonies, but they're actually able to use their mandibles to chew tunnels into wood. And this is what contributes to them being sometimes viewed as pests. The Xylicopa are the ones that are often getting the bad rap for this. And these large carpenter bees in Florida are made up of two species. So our southern carpenter bee, which is Xylicopa mikins, which you can see here on the two top pictures. And what's interesting about them is that our male is going to be the one on the left that's very bright and colorful there. And our female is the species, or is the individual on the right. And they're mostly black with some light kind of yellowish white on their thorax. So this is the same species, but they have a lot of sexual dimorphism and really don't look a lot like each other. The males are incapable of stinging. So this can be important because sometimes you'll see these bees being very territorial. They protect territories where they're interacting with mates. And if you encounter them, you might think that they're frightening, but really they're mostly harmless, being unable to sting. And even the females are very seldom sting. Usually they don't want anything to do with you. So not much to worry about with these bees from that perspective. Our eastern carpenter bee, Xylicopa virginica, is down here on the bottom. And that's also a male. You can tell by the yellow spot on its face. A female looks nearly identical, but doesn't have that yellow spot on her face. Some of these bees will have 2 annual generations in Florida, like I mentioned with some other species. One way to kind of help if you're having pest issues with them is typically they avoid treated or painted woods and are most likely to go after damaged woods. And even when they do burrow, they're very unlikely to cause major damage in low densities. Sometimes you run into problems when you have a ton of them and you have a lot of different nests. That can create some problems, but for most cases, if you have treated wood and not many of them, they're not going to create any long-term damage, unlike things like termites. These bees are just making their cavities for their nest. They don't actually feed on the wood like termites do. So no long-term damage there. They are valuable generalist pollinators, which is another reason to keep them around if they're not making any real problems for you. Okay, and now that we've learned a little bit about some of these species and their value, importance, and hopefully how to identify a few of them, I wanted to bring your attention to kind of the problem that we're facing with bees. So this really nice systematic review of the literature found that about half of North American native bee species were assessed to be in decline. And what's really scary about this is that they looked for about 4,300 species, and they were only able to come back with sufficient data for about 1/3 of those species. So that means about 2/3 of those species, we really don't know what's going on with their populations, and we don't have a great way to track them. But of those 1,500 species that they were able to track, they found that about half of them were assessed to be in decline, and then about half of those that were seen to be in decline, so 1/4 of the ones they assessed, were assessed to be at imperiled and at increasing risk of extinction. So really concerning numbers there. That if you kind of translate that out to the total numbers that they weren't able to evaluate, you can see how that can pretty drastically increase to as many as potentially 2,000 bees that are at risk of decline, and about 1,000 that could be at risk for extinction if those numbers hold up. So really concerning situation. And there's a lot of things that play into some of these conservation challenges and different things that are leading to pollinator declines that I want to talk about. I'm going to focus in on a few of them here. So one of the big ones is land use change. And this is kind of a two-pronged problem. When we're converting natural landscapes like this here on the left to human use landscapes like cities or farms, we need to be really conscious about that land that we're turning into human uses, because oftentimes there are floral resources and nesting habitat that were available in those previous landscapes that are just being removed. And without a place to nest and proper floral resources, these bees really don't have a chance in these new environments. So we need to be conscious about what we're converting to new landscape types, but also once we do, to try and provide as much habitat as possible within those new landscapes. Pesticides is another one that you'll hear a lot about. This one's a complicated one because in many cases, pesticides can be a really necessary tool, but we need to be really conscious when we're using them in systems like agriculture, employing integrated pest management tools where we're not spraying more than we need to be for the pest at hand, cut down on these prophylactic treatments. So things like seed coatings can often lead to more exposure to bees, and they're not really hitting a time when you need that protection from pests in some crops. So just really being thoughtful about when, where, and why we're applying insecticides. Oftentimes ornamental plants, although we all want our gardens to look pretty, it may not be worth it to treat with insecticides in a lot of cases if you're putting the bees that are visiting at risk. Climate change is another big one. And this one's a little tougher to deal with because there's not a whole lot you can do on the short term for yourself, but from this figure, you can kind of see one of the common responses that we have. And basically we start to see plants and pollinators decoupling from each other. So a bee will emerge historically at the same time that its flower resources will, but with temperature changes over time, we see that bees actually start to emerge. Bees actually emerge sooner than the flowers do in response to that change. And over time, the concern is that we don't know how that's going to continue, and will bees be emerging into environments without many flower resources. So this can also lead to changes in plant ranges, flower timing with the bees, and can alter plant nutritional values. So things like drought can lead to reduced nectar volume and all kinds of other things that bees are reliant on. Invasive plants and non-native pollinators. So non-native pollinators, things like honeybees and other bees that have come into the landscape. One of the problems is that they can outcompete bees for these floral resources that they're reliant on. But another thing is that they can, as oftentimes generalists that aren't as closely tied to the native plant species, they can lead to the propagation of invasives, and them continuing to pollinate invasive plants can lead to that invasive kind of increasing its density in a landscape. And then those invasives, of course, can outcompete native plants, and you can have a system where you lose a lot of native plant diversity, and the bees that then, of course, were reliant on those native plants are no longer having any resources. So saving the bees. It's important to note here that many practices that are useful for helping to preserve native bees are also good for honeybees, beekeepers, and gardeners too. And that's something I always like to point out, because you're not just doing these things to help out native bees, you're also going to help out your own interests. So whatever you do, whether it's gardening or keeping bees as a hobbyist, oftentimes planting more native flowers is going to be a really good tool, no matter what your interests are. So to get into some of the things that we can do for native bee conservation, first, of course, I think probably the biggest one is habitat preservation and restoration when it's appropriate. So really bringing back wildflowers that these bees can use, and ensuring that they have spaces for nesting and foraging habitat. Things like integrated pest management, which I briefly mentioned. So just really knowing when you need to apply for a pest with your insecticides, what the costs of doing so are, and only doing so when you really need to protect your crop or your plant. The management of invasive plants, so again, I touched on that, but there's a lot of great efforts here in Florida to manage things like Brazilian pepper tree down south that can have some of these problems I spoke about. Supporting local farmers and beekeepers. Both of these groups can be really great opportunities to kind of spread knowledge. So, you know, as I mentioned, oftentimes their interests are aligned with what works best for bees. And so providing them with knowledge and understanding of how we can help our native bees is really valuable. Resource responsibility. So thinking about what we're using, whether it's things like insecticides or land use, and being responsible about implementing changes. And then supporting conservation efforts. If you're here today, you already have a hand in that, which is excellent. And then research and education and inspiration. So really understanding more about these bees, learning about them, and then sharing that broadly with your friends and family. So some things that you can do related, I've really gone heavy on the floral resources. There's a lot that you can potentially do, but for this group, I thought this would be really valuable. So floral resources, again, are one of the best ways that you can support wild bees. And so we really like to target kind of this idea of planting a good diversity of blooming plants throughout the year. If you have a really finely timed bloom, that might be valuable for some species, but as we learned, not all these species are emerging at the same time. And so having flowering resources out and available at any time that a bee emerges is really valuable. So one way to do this, these are just kind of baselines, is to look for 12 species within a specific area and kind of spread those out with 3 blooming at any given time. So in the land that you manage, if you kind of meet those benchmarks, that will give you a lot of diversity that will be useful to various bees, but also differences in phenology that will ensure that flowers are available when bees emerge. Of course, native plants, that potentially goes without saying in this group, but native plants are incredibly important. These bees have been evolving with these plant species for millennia, and the opportunity to forage on something that they have such a close relationship to is really valuable. It leads to better growth of their offspring and healthier populations. So this is especially true for pollen resources, which have a lot of proteins that bees are really finely tuned on. So they need specific proteins. This is also really important for specialist bees. If you're a specialist bee that only goes after one genus or family of flowering plants, you need that plant to be available, or else you're not going to have anything to consume. So those native plants, you're going to be able to target specialist bees with them a way that you can't with a lot of our non-natives. And then also, if those things are impossible for you to do for whatever reason, non-native plants are still better than things like a parking lot, of course. So non-native plants can provide pollen and nectar, but they're really valuable for nectar. Oftentimes, bees can be making long foraging trips, and they begin to run out of energy, and having even something that's non-native in an area where there would otherwise be no nectar can kind of provide that little boost of energy they may need. And then, of course, plant in clumps, so really high densities. Just like us, it would probably be pretty inconvenient if we had to go all over town to fill out our grocery list. It's really nice when all of that stuff's available in one place, and you don't have to put a lot of effort to go get it all. So some kind of quick tips here on blooming plants. So early blooming plants, oftentimes you're looking for things like trees and shrubs. Kind of our later blooming plants, herbaceous wildflowers. So keep that in mind, especially because a lot of our bees are emerging early in the year, and they're really reliant on some of these trees and shrubs that are producing flowers. As far as what kind of flowers you should look for, so yellow, white, and purplish blue flowers are often preferable for bees. Bees are not as attracted to red, oranges, and pinks because they don't see those colors as well, or at all, depending on the color. Oftentimes you want to target kind of these short flower tubes. So like this image here on the right, where bees can easily access nectar and pollen, whereas these kind of longer tubes are going to be great resources for things like butterflies, but bees oftentimes don't have as long of a tongue and aren't able to access that nectar and pollen. And then you really want to hope to get as much nectar and pollen into the system as possible. So I'll just go through this really quickly. Here's some Florida wildflowers that you can consider. This would be a good place to take a picture if you're thinking about getting some of these in your garden or yard. But things like Elliott's aster, goldenrod, blanket flower, bee balm are all decent options that provide good nectar and pollen resources for these bees. And then something else that's gained a lot of attention that you could potentially do to help is these nesting resources. So as I mentioned, you're targeting the 30% of bees that use tubes, but you can also target bees that are underground with kind of relatively bare soil, minimal mulch, so not much in the area. For both of these, you're going to want good sun. So these bees are going to need warmth to develop. Little disturbance, that's an important one. You don't want something that's constantly disturbing it and may stop a bee from foraging. And then for these bee hotels, you really want to target tubes that are about at least 6 inches long. I think I accidentally put 6 feet, I mean 6 inches. Because as you can see here in this picture on the bottom right, that bees are going to create multiple cells in each of these tubes. And if it's not long enough, they're probably not even going to take their time to lay eggs in there. Finally, protecting bees from pesticides is an important thing that you can do even in your own garden. So minimizing pesticide use is really important. Try not to ever spray just because, oh, you know, I saw some chewing on one of my plants, better safe than sorry. Because it's usually not better safe than sorry. Usually you're promoting some kind of contact with valuable insects, beneficial insects like pollinators. So don't spray plants in bloom if at all possible. I know that's not always possible. And then look out for flowering weeds. So things that you might not even think about, try to avoid them because, you know, again, these are flowering resources that bees are reliant upon. And if you're spraying these things when they're in bloom, you're going to increase the contact. Spraying in low drift is important. So low wind, moderate temperatures. You don't want really high humidities because those things can volatilize and you can get your insecticides moving to places you didn't intend them to be. And then if you are having to spray, really look out for chemicals that are labeled as being bee safe or having low toxicity to bees. Those things are gonna still target the pests that they're intended for, but hopefully won't be as damaging for bees. And then, of course, as I mentioned, we can all kind of contribute to saving the bees. So hopefully you learned something today and you can take that back with you and implement some of these practices, whether it's adding more wildflowers or cutting down on your insecticide use. But if you're unable to do any of those things, please share something you learned with friends and family. You never know how that can inspire people and hopefully also help with some of these resources and practices. Real quickly, again, here's a slide. Most of these were on the list that will be provided to you. But if you wanted to take a quick picture, these are some really nice resources on wildflowers and bees in general, as well as our lab website there at the bottom. And then the white text there on the very bottom has been on all of these slides, but again, that's my Twitter. Follow me if you're interested in this stuff. I hope to share a lot of my research and findings and other interesting things about plants and bees. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you, John. That was wonderful. Where am I? Sorry, too many things open. We have quite a few questions. First question is from Teresa. She said she finds a lot of leafcutter bee cells on her cars or on the ground and wonders if the eggs inside are still viable or if they've blown around and come loose, are they damaged or dead at that point?
You know, like anything, that's a tough question to answer. I mean, part of it's going to be how damaged they look. You know, of course, if you see it all strewn apart, probably not going to be much to save there. But it's possible that if this is a little later in the year, kind of summer, that those things have already been capped and there are developing bees in there. If it still looks good, you could always just try and picking it up and kind of putting it in an area of your yard that you know, maybe you're giving it a chance to develop. Outside of that, there's not a ton you can do.
Great. Leslie asked, how do male longhorn bees use their antenna to attract females?
Yeah, so antennae are one of the ways that bees are really commonly, it's one of their most important senses. So they're really finely tuned on things like pheromones, and there's visual cues as well. So that's just all plays into that. The females are leaving kind of these sensory cues all over the place, and males use antenna as one of the important ways to find them.
Great. So Mara is asking, she says that bees are building nests in her composter. Her composter is empty, but she's twice found the comb fully developed, but the bees have gone, and found also dead bees. Do you have any explanation for why this might be happening, or why they're abandoning the nest that they're building?
Yeah, so a lot of times that sounds specifically like it's honeybees from what you're saying. A lot of times they'll be kind of swarming. So that can happen when their previous nest is no longer suitable, or if the colony is expanding, has produced a new queen, then half the colony will go out and try and find a new nest. It sounds like there's something about your composter that is attractive as a nesting option, but then isn't actually working out for them. So I think the best way for you to handle it would just be to try and avoid them getting in. So if there's any way that you could keep it more contained so that bees can't get in, then hopefully that won't continue to happen.
All right. Can you talk about nectar robbing and why bees do that, or which bees do that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. So nectar robbing is, for anyone who may not know, so oftentimes it's happening in flowers that have kind of these really big corollas where bees are having to get inside of the corolla. Things like blueberry that I work on. And bees are actively making slits in the corollas, so the petals of the flower, and they're able to access the nectar from outside of the flower without making what we call a legitimate foraging trip. Bees do it because like all living organisms, bees are trying to find an easy way to get the resources that they're looking for. And it's easier for them to do on a lot of these flowers. Things like carpenter bees are pretty well known to make some of these holes in corollas. And then oftentimes we'll see other bees using those when carpenter bees are present. So it really just comes down to trying to access the nectar as easily as possible.
Great. I have a couple of questions about bee hotels. Someone is asking if you recommend them because she's heard that they encourage disease spread. And another person is asking about materials to use, if you could use wood pallets and bamboo to make them, if you recommend making them or using them.
Yeah, I think like anything, they can be a useful tool. So oftentimes people will say, don't make them or don't put them out because they're concerned that people won't maintain them. These are living organisms, and like anything, they produce waste, and there are other things that are maybe trying to predate them or parasitize them. And so if you leave out this old bee hotel for years upon years and you do no maintenance on it, really spread some disease. I think some of the ones that we're really fond of, they have kind of these replaceable tubes that you can use, so almost like paper straws. And you could take those out yearly when the bees have emerged, and that will really cut down on any spread of pathogens. So that's a good option. As far as those specific types of woods that were mentioned, I would probably stay away from like old reclaimed wood. I would use like untreated woods. I don't have any specific woods that I think are better because I haven't done enough testing on this. But I think, again, using like paper straws or some kind of tube liner, which you can find online, are good options to kind of keep it clean.
Okay, just a couple more questions. I know we're getting close to 3 o'clock here. Is there any new research focused on the potential dangers of mosquito spray on bees that sleep out in the open? She's saying most research seems to focus on honeybees specifically.
Yeah, I haven't heard of a whole lot going down recently in that area. Of course, anytime that you're using an insecticide and it's coming in contact with an insect, that's concerning. Oftentimes, a lot of the things I know that are used for mosquitoes are really quite targeted at them. chemically. So that helps a little bit. They're a little less of a general use pesticide than a lot of our others. But oftentimes a lot of the negative consequences are things like reduced foraging ability, lower reproductive output, and things that aren't necessarily killing the bees, but make them less effective in reproduction and survival. So it's really hard to get a good answer on that.
All right, I have a couple requests from people to show the slide again with the recommended flowers. Would you mind backing up to that?
And again, this is far from comprehensive. There are all kinds of flowers that you could use. These are just some that people have mentioned they think are really attractive to bees and are really beautiful in their yards or good for gardening. So.
And when you mentioned, so you mentioned the 12 species or having 12 species with 3 blooming at all times. Marilyn's asking how many of each plant should you have? And I know other people we've worked with, like Jarrett Daniels, have talked about this idea of evenness or having not just a single plant, but multiple. So can you offer any guidance on like what, how much abundance do these bees need?
Yeah, so that's going to really vary on how many flowers each plant species is putting out that you're thinking about. But really, you want to, from a bee's perspective, about as densely as you can go would be valuable for them. So a lot of these native plants that may have seed mixes available, those are potentially good options because you're going to get really dense seeding and then hopefully really dense flowers if they're doing well in that spot. So I think from the bee's perspective, the more highly dense flowering resources they can have in one area is going to be really valuable for them.
Okay, and just one last question. Is it true once a bee stings, it loses its stinger and will die?
Yeah, so that's true of honeybees. And honeybees have barbed stingers. So when they sting another insect, that doesn't happen. The barb doesn't get stuck in other insects. But when they sting a mammal with kind of our softer fleshy skin, that barb gets stuck in there. And then as they pull away, of course, they die. That isn't true of almost all of our native species. So they can sting repeatedly. They're not producing or pushing in as much venom when they do so, but they're not going to die upon each sting. And part of the reason for that is that each honeybee, and it's such a large colony, it's more important for that colony survival to protect those resources than it is for that individual bee to live. But a lot of our native bees that are solitary, obviously their own survival and their offspring survival is the most important. So dying would be a huge disadvantage.
That's interesting. I didn't know that was different for other insects than when they sting us. So.
And real quickly, I see a question that I want to answer. So about bee hotels and cleaning them over winter. So oftentimes with most of these bees, that's when they're really going to need that resource because they're still nesting in it. So a lot of times around this time of year is when you would most want to clean them out because most of the bees will have emerged from those bee hotels. And so there shouldn't be as much in there. If you're cleaning them out in the winter, pretty much everything that was in there wouldn't make it.
Great. Well, we do have a resource on creating and caring for a bee hotel that I will include in the resource list that we send out to you all. For those of you that are asking about when the recording will be available, it'll be about 24 to 48 hours. It'll be on YouTube and our website, and we will include a link to that once it's available. So everyone who is here and everyone who signed up will get a link to rewatch this webinar. If you didn't get your question answered, and I see John is responding, so we can definitely get those questions to John to get some answers. I just want to wrap up here since we've been at this for a little over an hour, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So thank you all. Thank you, John, so much. This has been a really interesting presentation with a lot of good information crammed into a short period of time. So thank you.
Yeah, and if anybody has these questions and wants to email me directly also, it's just jternest@UFL, so University of Florida.edu. I know I said that pretty quickly, but maybe they can send out that information as well.
Yeah, as long as that's okay with you, we'll include your email address in the resources too. So, great. Okay, great. Thanks everyone for attending. Thank you again, John. This was really wonderful, and look for an email from us with recording and resources. Bye, everyone.
Thank you everyone for having me.
Bye-bye.